And thanks everyone for joining today. So yeah, my name's Hope Virgo and I am an author and mental health campaigner. So I basically spend my life kind of traveling all over the world, doing a lot of work with schools, corporates and hospitals. And then also was what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today, do a lot of campaigning work. So lobbying the government, mainly on issues around eating disorders and exercise addiction, but also kind of on that much broader picture of mental health as well. So we've got kind of 15, 20 minutes or so in the session today. So it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of everything, but the slides will obviously be available at the end of the session if anybody would like to get hold of those as well. But just to kind of kick things off, I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about my own experience, which is kind of, I guess, the reason why I do a lot of campaigning. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned over the last kind of couple of years or so with campaigning is when you do something that is something that personally impacts you, it becomes such a passion of yours. And I think for me, it's been that's really driven me. But also, it means that you have to make sure that you have a solid foundation in your own kind of recovery journey, if you're talking about eating disorders or mental health issues, but also looking at the foundations around you more generally, who you're surrounding yourself with, who you've got supporting you. And so that you can set those boundaries and make sure that it's not having that kind of negative impact on you as well. So as a bit of background, so obviously I campaign on eating disorders, and the reason I predominantly do that is because I've had my own lived experience of an eating disorder. So I was first diagnosed when I was 17 years old, but had spent kind of 4 years prior to that kind of in the grips of the illness without really realizing what was going on. I'm sure some of you will be aware of eating disorders, but they are very secretive illnesses, and people pretty much do what they can do to hide what's happening. You fast track through that 4 years to my diagnosis. I then spent about 6 months as an outpatient and then spent a year living in an inpatient unit in Bristol, where I was growing up at the time. I then was discharged, kind of spent the next 8, 9 years in a really good space for my recovery, and then unfortunately did relapse in about 2016. When I came through my relapse, I realized that there was this huge lack of understanding about eating disorders. There was this huge lack of understanding about eating disorders, not just from society, but also within the NHS itself. I found it really frustrating that I'd been unable to access treatment because I didn't fit into this neat criteria. And I realized that this isn't something that was just happening to me, but it was something that was happening to so many people on a day-to-day basis, people constantly being turned away from services for not being underweight enough. And it was that when I kind of got to a better space in my recovery was when I really began to start campaigning. I began to speak up a little bit more about things. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I did that in a moment. But it was that, like I said, that kind of really drove me into this action point. I realized that I could sit around and kind of complain about the lack of treatment, the lack of services, but I needed to start to embed change myself and implement that for what I thought that would look like moving forward. So the kind of old question, why do I campaign? And I've mentioned a little bit already about my own personal experience, but also when we look at the statistics around eating disorders, they are really, really harrowing. I'm sure that a lot of you will be aware that over the last couple of years, we've seen this huge increase in the number of people who are currently struggling. When we look at the adult population, so people aged 16 plus, we know that at any one point, 16% of people will present positively with an eating disorder. We also know that there is very, very little support out there currently. You've probably got loved ones, maybe even you yourself have tried to get support for an eating disorder, have been told that you're not underweight enough. Or perhaps you've been told you're too complex or you're not now treatable. And it's these things that mean that we have to keep pushing forward for that support. The other thing with eating disorders, which is a real driver for me, was that they have still so much stigma attached to them. They have this huge lack of understanding. People still think that eating disorders only affect white, teenage, emaciated girls. But actually, they present in people of all different body sizes, people from all different backgrounds, shapes, races, genders. And they also have the highest mortality rate of any other psychiatric illness. And this does not need to be the case because we know that eating disorders are preventable and they are also treatable. So I've got my first-hand experience. Again, like I've said, it's a real driving factor. And that's the first thing I think you need to think about when you're looking at what you want to campaign on, what things drive you, what gives you that passion, that purpose, what gets you out of bed in the morning, what are the things that you think about when you're walking down the street or the kinds of people that you're drawn to. those things will probably give you that driving factor to move forward and to keep going when things get hard when you're campaigning. I also wanted to share that the reality of eating disorders, the kind of harrowing reality that they completely take over a person's life, that they take away and zap happiness out of so many situations, but also that hope that people can get well and people do fully recover. I was frustrated about the lack of action. And then I also wanted people to realize that no one is untreatable. And that's a huge part of my campaigning work at the moment, actually, that kind of push to make sure that every single person can get support, regardless of how long they've had the illness. So I began by writing a book. I know some of you might think that sounds like quite a hard beginning. Some of you might think that sounds like an easy, wishy-washy beginning. But I was working full time at the time and approached kind of various publishers, was kind of set on this being what I wanted to do. Kind of get my story out there, share that harrowing reality, but also the hope of recovery. And once I'd started doing that, once I'd kind of got it out there, I then began to talk about my experience a lot more. I began to go into schools, kind of speaking up. I began to share my thoughts on social media, became quite vocal in that space, kind of commenting on things that I saw in the press, on the TV. I volunteered with various charities, which again is a really good starting point if you're looking into getting into campaigning. Find the charities that you're passionate about, get that experience to them, whether that's through doing bits of media, whether that's through doing bits of writing. I remember the amount of blogs I wrote for places just as a way to kind of start to kind of get, I guess, my understanding out there, but also to kind of become the name of people would come to. And then I thought about what I actually wanted to specifically campaign on. Eating disorders is such a broad spectrum. And again, if you pick your topic, there'll be so many things that you can focus on. But one of my real drivers, having been turned away from services for not being underweight, was I realized that I didn't want anyone to go through what I'd been through in that moment. That kind of insecure moment where you're like, no one understands, no one gets it. That feeling that you have to make yourself kind of sicker in order to kind of get that support. The thing that people think that you're just being difficult or that you're choosing to be this way. And I wanted people to understand that eating disorders have no one particular look. That someone can look healthy and look fine, but they might still be struggling mentally. I remember I went to give a talk at the NSPCC. And whilst I was giving that talk, I remember talking about my kind of relapse and what it had been like, what it had felt like. And at the end of the session, someone said to me, what are you doing in that space? How are you going to challenge that? And I had no idea. And I kind of fudged an answer, basically being like, oh yeah, I'm going to set up a campaign. And that was when my campaigning kind of really began to step up a notch. And I developed a campaign called Dump the Scales, which was all around getting rid of that criteria, making sure that anybody can access support and treatment, regardless of their BMI. It started off as quite kind of, I guess, just fixated on that one issue in itself. And gradually over kind of a few years, began to grow into something else. It began to look at things around funding, so making sure that we have ring-fence funding for eating disorders. It looked at issues around training, so again, that kind of stigma and the understanding. Most recently, it's been looking much more at palliative care pathways. So we know now that people with eating disorders, if they've been unwell for more than 5 years, they will be moved onto a palliative care pathway in a lot of situations. We also know that people are often being marked as too complex, and then again, they will move on to that palliative care pathway. It's about ending those pathways to make sure that people can get the best possible treatment. And it's also about ending the postcode lottery for treatment. So again, making sure that wherever you're based in the country, you can access that support. I kind of narrowed it down to these things, which, like I said, it kind of grew, it then shrinks at times, it then grows at points. And at the moment, kind of gearing up for the next general election, again, making sure that we're campaigning on the right stuff and the things that will have impact. But it hasn't always been this like huge success of a campaign. I wouldn't probably say it's even been that successful to some extent. It's very difficult to get the government to commit to funding. And it has been difficult because eating disorders are often kind of pushed off the map in so many of these conversations. But the campaign has been to Downing Street on a number of occasions. I've hosted a number of photo calls. I've kind of looked at the various communications angles that we can take when we are thinking about campaigning and looking at these various routes we can take. I did try and call for the government to scrap the calorie labelling on menus, but unfortunately we weren't successful with that. And that is something that they've kind of gone ahead with. But what I've learned during that process is even when something doesn't go to plan, there's other avenues you can explore. So whilst we might still now see calories plastered everywhere when we go to restaurants, there's other opportunities. We can educate young people and adults on why calorie counting is a completely pointless thing to do, that it doesn't show the health of the food, that it doesn't really give an individual what they need. And again, the more we look at those educational fronts, the other aspects we can kind of take, the more change we can cause. And I think that for me is when it becomes quite a kind of grassrootsy type thing, actually starting at that kind of lower level, looking at kind of society as a whole, changing that stigma, and that will then empower people to make those decisions, which will then have that knock-on effect. Apart from that, and another huge risk that I felt like I took this year, and it was actually last year now, kind of forget we're in 2024 now. So in 2023, I hosted the UK's first ever eating disorders protest. Again, I was absolutely terrified before it happened. I thought no one was going to be there. And even on the way there, I was kind of counting up the number of people. I think I got to about 7 people that I knew were definitely going to come. And I was like, do you know what? It's okay if that's all that happens. We'll just see. But on that day, we had hundreds of people come together. And when you look at it kind of strategically, I remember my husband saying to me, like, what's the purpose of this? Like, what's it actually going to achieve? And I'm sure that some of you have been on protests yourself. And I love a protest. I've been on quite a few in my time. And I really like kind of the bringing together of people. But I never know how much of an impact they actually have. Yes, you'll have the odd one that really does, but a lot of them, they don't have that kind of concrete impact then. But what they do, and what this protest did, was it brought together people who felt so categorically wrong in who they are, that they had to find other people around them where they could seek that support. It helped people to not feel alone in their fight. And it helped people to feel empowered, that they were part of something making a difference. And we're actually currently organising the second one, which is taking place at the end of April, in a couple of months now, where again, we're going to bring together the kind of same groups of people again, hopefully more people this year. And again, try and kind of push for that concrete action and that impact as well. But the things I really wanted to share with you, and I know like we haven't got a huge amount of time today, and I could probably talk about all of this stuff for hours and hours. So do kind of get in touch if there's stuff that you want to kind of find out a little bit more information on. But I wanted to just share a couple of things that I've learned. I'm not going to go through this entire list, but just to kind of pull out a few. So the first thing is actually the reality is campaigning can be unbelievably lonely. I have campaigned the majority of my time on my own. About a year and a half ago, I put together kind of an expert group. So myself kind of sees it over. And then I've got other experts who kind of geneticists, kind of clinicians, carers, like other people who are also passionate about eating disorders. And most recently, I've kind of put together a group of people to kind of support on the general election campaigning that I'll be doing. But it still can be that lonely place. It can be the most frustrating place where you're calling for things that you think are just such basic things to be asking for, but yet you're getting this constant pushback. It can be lonely when you turn up at Parliament to take photos of MPs and like 1 or 2 people come. And you have to think about how can you paint this on social media so it looks like this really amazing event happened and things like that. And again, that's something you need to be aware of in that loneliness, is what we see on social media is often so much of the time kind of plastered and not always the reality of actually what's happened. You've also got to be aware that everybody will have an opinion on what you're doing. I remember when I launched the protest last year, I had the amount of people that got in touch with me telling me I shouldn't be doing a protest because people with eating disorders shouldn't be walking that much, or they might have an exercise addiction alongside it. And I have had to get a bit of a thicker skin, but also realizing that actually I don't have to battle with every single person who gets in touch telling me they don't agree with what I'm doing. There are some battles that I think are worth fighting, and sometimes being silent is just not an option for me. And the huge kind of controversial issues within the palliative care pathways at the moment with eating disorders, again, that's an issue that I've chosen not to remain silent on. But we have to work out where we want to pick our battles and what things are worth kind of, I guess, exerting that energy on. I've also had to set boundaries in what I do. So kind of having that kind of isolated time to campaign, making sure that I'm looking after myself in this. And I'm not great at that, but again, kind of allowing that time. And something that has actually really helped that is I've got a 19-month-old baby at the moment, and actually having him does make me kind of focus my time a lot better, purely because I have much less time available to be doing campaigning. So it becomes a bit more focused, but also kind of working out where I have the energy to be supporting people. How can I help people? And how can I have the biggest impact kind of moving forward as well? But that's something, again, there'll be other people who probably will know much better than me how to manage that. And mine is definitely a kind of work in progress as well. I think you also, when you're campaigning, you have to find a way to campaign through everything. So if you're thinking about getting into campaigning, have a think about where your topic fits with things. I know with eating disorders, for example, that yes, we have a couple of key points in the year that you can position yourself. We have awareness weeks, we have things like Christmas, which is really challenging for people affected by eating disorders. But also there are other times of the year, things like the summer, things like going back to school. Again, find out where your campaign could fit along that whole year and plan that into your kind of action in your protest, your action and your plans as well. It's about surrounding yourself with the right people. So people who will cheer you on throughout your campaigning, but also people who will call you out if they don't agree with what you're doing. People who feel okay to, people who even feel okay to say, do you know what, you need to take a moment for yourself, have a bit of a touch base and kind of check in with yourself as well. And then also just kind of having that moment of trust, reminding yourself that it's not about you, being honest through kind of prayer about what you're going through and how you're processing things as well. And for me, that's been a really, really big part of my own campaigning, kind of again, allowing that space to be vulnerable and scared and showing that fear, but also at the same time asking myself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid in that moment? What things would I be calling for? What things would I be organizing from a campaign perspective if I didn't have that fear? And then just very quickly, just before we finish, I can never do these kind of sessions, regardless of whether they're on campaigning or eating disorders, without leaving with you a few little things about eating disorders. So the first thing with eating disorders, when we are talking about them, and again, I'm obviously extremely passionate about this, and I believe that we have, all of us, a duty of responsibility to challenge and fight the stigma around eating disorders. I just wanted to remind you that you don't have to be an expert to be talking about this. You have to be thinking about how you can become an ally to your friends who have eating disorders or who struggle themselves. There's a couple of ideas on the screen in front of you that you can kind of take away and think about. But beyond that, we have to be trying to bring out all of these conversations into the open. I believe that the only way that people can fully heal from eating disorders is to bring out all of those behaviors into the light, to get that support they need. And by doing that, people can recover. But we have that role to play within that, about listening to each other, not trying to fix each other, being patient, asking people. And above all, like being really mindful of the kinds of things you're saying. Come on, it's January. Everyone's talking about dieting, this new you, me kind of thing at the moment. Again, just avoid that diet chat. Be mindful of those conversations because you never know the impact that that might have on people. And then on the screen in front of you, there are a couple of other places that you can go and get some additional support with regards to eating disorders, but also much more broadly with your mental health as well. But thank you, everyone, for listening today. I hope you found it interesting and insightful. I feel like I said, there's a lot of stuff that we could cover when we're talking about campaigning and kind of the ins and outs of it and the emotions around it. But given the kind of limited time we had today, I hope that, yeah, it was kind of what you were expecting. I have put my email address on the screen. So if there are other things that you'd like to pick up with me at any point, please do feel free. And I would also encourage you to kind of check out the Dump the Scales campaign, to sign it, to share it, and also to keep an eye out over the next couple of weeks of a couple more kind of campaigny updates, things that we're going to be launching, things that we're going to be working on moving forward as well. And then finally, if you are particularly interested in campaigning around eating disorders, more kind of as your thing, please do feel free to get in touch and I can again share some more of that with you. But thank you everyone for listening.